I think that we have Chessa behind the scenes and she's going to start the recording. While that gets started, my name is Chloe Hundelt. I'm the grant specialist for NACD. This is the NACD webinar on the Partnership for Climate-Smart Commodities Planning and Capacity Grants, Request for Proposals. So a couple of things before we dive in. Please mute yourself if you haven't already. We do have somebody on the back end who will mute you if we hear noises come up, but it's helpful if you keep yourself muted from the start. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box while we're talking, and then we'll get to those at the end. If you're on the phone and you're not able to access the chat box, we'll also give you an opportunity at the end of the meeting to speak your questions on the phone. And like I had mentioned, the meeting will be recorded and then we'll share it via email and on our website. So if you'd like to access this meeting later, there will be a recording available. Next slide, please. So today we're going to go over the Partnership for Climate-Smart Commodities Planning and Capacity RFP. So that's going to include what we just did, which was the welcome, and then the goals for Partnership in Climate-Smart Commodities. We'll briefly touch on that. And then we'll get deeper into the RFP and what's in the RFP and information about the application. And then we'll open it up for questions. And just a reminder, this is specifically for planning and capacity grants. We had a separate webinar for project grants. And so if you're interested in learning more about the project grants, there's a recording of that webinar available on our website. And I'm going to pass it over to our Chief Program Officer, Jen Nelligan, who's going to go a little bit more into the goals for the partnership.
Thanks, Chloe. Good afternoon for some of you. I really enjoyed the chat. I think we have some of our folks in the Pacific Islands as well. So hafa day and good morning to you all as well. So I'll just jump right in here. Many of you might be familiar already with USDA's Partnerships for Climate-Smart Commodities grant program, as well as our RFP for project grants. And if you follow along at all, you might know that these grant programs are actually fairly complex. Each of the projects has to touch upon three elements, right? So one is really scaling the implementation of climate smart practices, and that's across new acres and with new producers. But it's not enough to just implement the practices. USDA is very interested in ensuring that we're measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verifying not only the completion of these practices, but quantifying the associated GHG benefits, as well as any other co-benefits such as water quality or biodiversity. But quantification is a really important part of this grant. And the third component is for developing and expanding markets for the resulting commodities. And the team's going to get into each one of those definitions in a little bit, but I just want to clarify here that the market for those commodities is for the physical good. It's not necessarily a carbon market or a carbon program. And so each of these things is very big. It could be their own grant in and of themselves. So that's a lot of scope to cover, particularly for organizations that might lack the resources or the administrative capacity to then develop the projects. But as many of you know, as at NACD, one of our key goals and mission is to support and advance voluntary, locally led, and incentive-based conservation that has to be economical for the producer. And so while we know on the conservation side that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, we feel the same way for how markets get developed. I think we can all agree that each community needs the support and flexibility to develop the markets or economies that work for them. And so that's really the goal of these planning capacity grants. We're incredibly excited about some of these larger scale national or regional programs that we're seeing, not only through USDA, but through the larger project grant RFP. But we know that not everyone can participate in those, right? And we're really looking for ways that we can support capacity building, whether it's in outreach and technical assistance, MRV capabilities, or markets, within local communities as district-led projects. And so really what we're hoping is that conservation districts, some of their territory or state associations, as well as departments of natural resources or ag, right? Some of the local producer groups, we're hoping that these grants will help fund some of the partnerships to be able to develop these really complex, but often very exciting climate smart projects. And so with that, I'll pass it over to the team, and I'll pass it over to Kanisha Reynolds, who's our new Conservation Programs Director, to get into the details of what the scope looks like, as well as the next steps for the RFP.
Thanks so much, Jen. As you rightly said, we know how difficult it is just to be able to get the partners together, to be able to develop these projects to submit under this competitive grant funding and the time it takes to do that for different reasons, right? It could be the administrative capacity that could pose a barrier. It could be that these grants, especially when you're talking about the Climate-Smart Commodities program, that it requires strong plans. And so there's this outreach and technical assistance and education component. There is the MMRV that Jen just mentioned. So that's the measurements and monitoring and reporting and verification plans, as well as the marketing plan that are really important. So these are complicated, complex partnerships to build, strategy to work through, and projects to develop and implement. And so, as Jen said, that this planning and capacity grant is then, meant to support those early stage development of a climate smart commodity project. We know a lot of our organizations or districts might be interested in taking advantage of the climate smart commodities program, but are not able to do so, just currently. And so these planning and capacity grants are intended to help the development of those projects that could then be submitted competitively later on. So again, these planning and capacity grants, it might be limited, but they are intended to just help you to build some preliminary capacities to begin thinking about programming in the different areas that Jen just mentioned. So the outreach and technical assistance, which is meant to help to scale up the adoption of climate smart practices, or to develop those MMRV plans, or to help to develop the marketing plans. So for example, under outreach and technical assistance, then through this planning and capacity grant, you could start to do some community and producer needs assessment, or you could start to test out those potential collaborations that might be possible, or to scope out or identify some of the technical assistance or education models that might be available for you to use later on. You could also use this planning and capacity grants to start to develop those partnerships with, as Jen says, community-based organizations, or just tribal organizations that are serving tribal farmers and historically underserved producers, because through this grant, historically underserved producers must participate through your projects. In terms of the MMRV plan, through the planning and capacity grants, then you could be starting to develop the partnerships and maybe the strategies that are necessary to advance your MMRV component of this grant, or start to think about maybe the strategies for compensating these producers for their environmental outcomes and for the benefits that are generated through these practices that are put on the ground. Also under MMRV, you could possibly be working on maybe developing some framework for conservation field trials that can help to advance indigenous practices, or TEK, the traditional ecological knowledge, which we hear this a lot, that, we don't want this knowledge to go lost. With older generation, they want to pass that on. So through this planning and capacity, you could be focusing on strategies of how to ensure that we're making sure that the knowledge is being passed on. And also just making sure that whatever practices are being put on the ground, that they are compliant with NRCS programs and program policies and their processes. Under the market plan or market development piece, you could be using these planning and capacity grants to start to really identify or to assess some of those markets that might currently be available but are not utilized for, climate smart commodities, which could then be expanded. Or maybe you have to think about developing these new markets. Maybe the markets aren't available and you'll have to think about, developing new markets, and that could be at the local level, at the regional level, or at the national level. So there's a variety of things that you could consider on this planning and capacity grant that could help you to build out the scope for a project grant in the future that will cover all these three key components that we just mentioned. Again, I'm just going to repeat this. When you do get to the stage of developing these grants, you have to cover all three. And so when you're doing the planning and capacity proposal, please do focus on how you could advance each component and to be able to meet the goal of the planning and capacity grants. All right, so as I just talked about this a whole lot, so I'm not going to go into this too much more. But again, the outcome for us here on this planning and capacity grant is to make sure that the recipients are thinking about, long-term climate smart commodities projects, and the projects have to address these key components. I will say, because Jen, you mentioned this already, but under the outreach, education, technical assistance, and financial assistance, you're really thinking about how you could reach new producers or underserved producers, maybe new acres. So developing an outreach plan so you can reach underserved producers, developing education and technical assistance to help these producers to not only understand, but to get the practices on the ground. Also under the MMRV plan, as Jen mentioned, we're really looking not just to measure, but also to monitor and to report and to verify that these outcomes are what we say that they would be. Again, under the market piece, it's not about the carbon markets. It's more thinking about markets for the commodities that are being developed under through these practices. Next slide, please. Oh, go ahead, Jen.
You just said it so well, but I just wanted to reinforce something because we live in this every day, right? And I thought I'd try to reinforce some of what you shared, Kanisha, already. But as we had mentioned, like the projects are different, right? That's really looking at the implementation of all of these things. For planning and capacity grants, we recognize, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but they're maxed out at 15K. We do have a separate pool that we'll be competing later on for project grants, but it's just something for us to help. We thought it would be helpful to share this just to remind folks that this is really the ultimate goal, right? It's implementation in these three pieces. I think what the planning and capacity grants look like and what some of those applications look like, those are all be a little bit different. And Kanisha, you gave some fantastic examples before of how maybe it's not actually developing the market just yet, but it's planning for that. It's assessing the needs and things like that. So I just wanted to, sorry, Kanisha, just pop in and just help folks, kind of help understand the difference of what we're thinking about when we talk about planning versus project implementation.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Yes, what I'm talking about right now is those the future projects that will come from your planning and capacity grants, because that's the outcome that we're looking for, right? Next slide, please. All right, so in addition to the three components we just talked about, those future projects that we're talking should also be addressing these different things. So you should be leveraging the locally led conservation delivery system to provide the education, the technical assistance that's needed to transition to these climate smart systems. Also, those projects should develop economic opportunities within the communities to build local capacities that can sustain these projects long-term, right? So beyond the life of the grant, and also to seek to mitigate historical and systematic barriers within the broader food system. So as you're developing your planning and capacity grants, just make sure that you're thinking about and developing the necessary strategies, the plan, the resources, the milestones for each of these three components that I just mentioned. Chloe, I'll pass it back to you to go through the RFP details.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to go over some of the details about, I guess more of the logistical details about the application. Maximum award amount for these capacity building grants will be $15,000. There is a 10% match requirement, which means that if you're requesting $15,000, then the match required would be $1,500. And match could possibly be waived for these grants if 100% of the project will be serving underserved producers. And anyone who receives a planning and capacity grant will be eligible to compete for a future pool of projects, project grants. So those are for those bigger implementation grants. And those projects can be anywhere from $50,000 to $750,000 per project. So it's anticipated that the request for proposals for that project pool, so specifically for our planning and capacity grantees to compete for project grants, that will be released in spring 2025 is the goal. And those projects will be evaluated and selected on a competitive basis. And again, that pool of funding will be limited to grantees that have received a planning and capacity grant. But it's important to note that receiving a planning and capacity grant does not guarantee that you will also then receive a project implementation grant. You'll still need to submit the proposal and go through the competitive process. The length of the project will be 12 months from the award date. And the deadline to submit these applications will be May 15th of this year. So we still have a little bit of time. Next slide, please. So eligible participants include conservation districts or tribal conservation districts, state or territory associations of conservation districts, RC&D councils, or tribal government or intertribal consortiums. And as a note here at the bottom, organizations representing underserved producers may apply as the lead applicant, but the proposal and the project must engage one of these eligible participants that's listed above, heavily engaged with one of the eligible participants. So as a note, the tribal government or intertribal consortiums include federally recognized Indian tribal governments and state designated Indian tribes. An intertribal consortium must meet the definition for eligibility in the environmental program grants for the tribe final rule, which is in the Code of Federal Regulations. And it's a a long citation for the CFR, so I'm not going to list it, but if you need more information, you can reach out to me directly. And you must also be a nonprofit organization within the definition that's listed in the uniform guidance, that's 2 CFR 200. NACD will also accept, as I had said, from other organizations if you represent underserved producers, as long as you're engaging a district or one of these other eligible applicants. And as it's been noted, NACD is committed to advancing equity, justice, and equal opportunity by sustaining fairness in the way program services and technical assistance are delivered within agency policies and practice. And eligible geographies include anywhere in the United States, and that includes territories of Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit more information on our evaluation criteria, how we'll review the proposals for the planning and capacity grants. This is also in section 2.5 of the RFP if you want a little bit more detail. So 25% will be weighted on the project goals and the timeline. So it's important to demonstrate a clear understanding of the Climate-Smart Commodities grant program, and that the goals and plans and milestones for your project are very clear and realistic and feasible given the 12-month timeline and the capacity and capability of the grantee and their partners. 25% will be weighted on the technical approach. So that includes the strength and the clarity of your approach to developing partnerships and strategies for scaling practices, developing your MMRV plans, and developing your climate smart market. So what Kanisha had talked about before for project components, also demonstrating an understanding of the local needs and your local producers, and a description of how the project will fit in with the district's long-term strategic plan. And lastly, for technical approach, the strength of your partnerships with your neighboring conservation districts and your potential partners, including any commitments from your community partners, so working groups, MMRV providers, or market partners. 25% will be weighted on your alignment towards our goal of leaving no producer behind. So that includes the strength of your outreach plan to tribes or underserved producers, which is a key component of these projects, and the strength of your collaboration with those groups. So that includes tribes, tribal organizations, or community-based organizations that represent underserved producers. So your strategy for reaching those groups and partners that represent them. And then lastly, 25% will be weighted on a couple other aspects of your project. So that includes the sustainability of your project. So how well the project can be sustained past the project period, your past performance on any potential projects with NACD. So if you've received a grant from NACD in the past, then that will be considered here in the other category. If you have not received a grant from NACD in the past, it won't be counted against you. But it's just whether you submitted reports on time and were responsive and a good steward of grant funds with NACD in the past. That's something that we'll consider. Also, we'll do a risk analysis. So just looking at some of the potential risks of the project, including, financial tracking, technical risks or programmatic risks. So just things that we will consider in this category as well. We'll also consider the budget in this section, or this 25%. So I'm going to go a little bit more detail in the budget later, but just the level of detail provided in your project budget and the descriptions of how the funds are going to be used to accomplish your goals. So making that connection really clear. And then it's also important to note that we will consider the diversity of applications when we make selections. So we want to make sure that we give awards to a diverse pool of applicant or grantees if you're awarded. So that will include looking at geography, the size and the scale of the projects, the commodities that will be targeted, and the types of operations that will be targeted. So something else to consider when we're evaluating these proposals. So quite a bit falls under that other category. Next slide, please. And for this slide, I'm actually going to pass it back to Jen, who's going to go a little bit more into our lessons learned from the concept papers period of this program.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. So, as you're all thinking about what your applications for planning capacity grant might look like, I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, in which case you can always reach out to us at climate@nacdnet.org. But thought I'd share a few of the things that we kind of saw in the project grants. One is that, conservation districts being conservation districts, really, really strong in outreach, education, and technical assistance strategies. But I think that we just wanted to clarify here that it's really not just about that, right? These are really unique grants in that developing MMRV and developing market plans is equally important, right? So that's also something to think about as you're developing your application. Knowing that these are planning grants, right? You might not have all of the answers today or by May when the proposals are due, but having a clear plan for how you're going to develop those plans and strategies and partnerships will be really important in the application. And, again, we understand that it's hard to plan something today because even as you're implementing it, things can change over the course of time. And that's okay, but still we really look for clearly articulated project milestones and timelines. Even though we can be flexible, right? We know sometimes those change, but what's more important is that you have really clear goals and potential partnerships, right? Yes, this is about capacity building, but capacity building with an objective in mind, which is what this project might look like in the future. We also saw, at least on the project side, that the market plan, having a clear market plan really gave folks a competitive advantage. And so what we kind of saw there too is that the ones that had stronger plans tended to be a little bit more specific about the commodities that they were trying to work with. And it could still be broad, right? You could be as broad as specialty crops or pulse, which encompasses multiple things. It doesn't have to be just one, but it does help when you're thinking about the market piece because each one of those has different supply chains, right? There are different types of partners you might want to look for, different types of engagement strategies. So we did find that clarity and some level of specificity was really helpful. And also, as you all might know, the processes and the partners for actually measuring the carbon or environmental outcomes can be very different, right? Take a forestry project versus corn and wheat versus commodity or versus maybe vegetables, right? Sorry, trying to say too many things at once, specialty crops. Each one of those would have a very different quantification approach and potentially very different partnerships, right? So you do want to be clear, otherwise it might be so broad and so generic that, we might not get a sense of the goals that you have. And then the fourth piece being, with conservation districts and partners and community-based organizations being so in tune with community needs and producer dynamics, what we always found was really helpful is when you're able to really articulate what those barriers are today, whether they're barriers that you already know exist or barriers that you think exist and would like to explore further, helping us understand what that means and what that looks like in your community is incredibly helpful, as well as how you might go about mitigating or addressing those barriers and challenges. One of our goals for our grant, and it's kind of the tagline, is trying to ensure that producers aren't left behind in this, right? Particularly small rural producers, small and mid-sized farms. Those are incredibly important, types of producers that we'd like to work with. And we know that it's a really important goal and priority for USDA as well. So we thought we might share some of those, but glad to dig into Q&A as we move forward and, over during this webinar, but also over the next couple of months if you all need to reach out. So thanks, Chloe, and I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just briefly before we wrap up, I'm just going to go a little bit over the proposal instructions. So if you want more detail on the proposal instructions, it's going to be in section 4 of the RFP. There's going to be 4 pieces to the proposal. So that's the technical proposal, letters of support, the budget template, and then the budget narrative. So the technical proposal includes the questions that you'll have to answer. So that includes multiple choice questions as well as longer answer questions. So Jen just posted a link to the RFP in the chat if anyone wants to go check it out. So the technical proposal starts in section 4.3. So that's the questions, the sequence, and then also the page limits for each question. We are going to utilize an electric form to collect the proposal, but we don't have a link to that at this time. That will be coming soon. The budget table is also in the I'm sorry. I skipped over letters of support. So the lead applicant will have to submit letters of support from any named partners, as well as from your local conservation districts and from their respective associations. So your state, territory, or your tribal association or government. So that will ensure we're supporting our members and that the projects are supported by the locally led conservation delivery system. So the budget template is in the RFP, and that's in section 5.3. So that'll give more detail on the structure that we're looking for the budget, and the line items that are allowed in the budget. So there's a little bit more detail on the costs that you can put in your budget there. One thing I just want to make a note of is that it's important to understand the difference between a lead partner, a project partner, and a contractor. So the lead partner is the grantee, the applicant that is applying to receive the funds directly from NACD. A project partner is a subawardee. So if you're going to pass funds down to another organization to complete some aspect of the project through like a grant that you'll be hosting with these funds, so kind of passing through the funds onto another organization as a grantee, then that's a subawardee, and that falls under the other category. And then a contractor is somebody or an organization that you're hiring to do a specific part of the project, and that has to follow a procurement process that's in line with uniform guidance. So I mentioned 2 CFR 200 previously. If you're not familiar with uniform guidance, it's a whole big document and it's available online, but I'm happy to answer questions if you want to reach out and talk more about that. There's specific procurement standards for obtaining contractors that you'll have to follow if you do choose to get a contractor for any piece of the award. So you'll have to delineate your budget or break down the costs out a little bit into categories so that we know where the funds are going to. And then you'll also be required to submit a budget narrative. And so those questions are in section 5.4 of the RFP. And so this will describe the expenses that you anticipate for each line item, how you estimated the cost, and how the expense will contribute to the project deliverable. So as I had discussed a little bit in the evaluation criteria, it'll be important to show a clear connection between the cost and how it will accomplish a project outcome. So that will be part of the budget narrative. So I think that kind of covers everything for the proposal. So I think, Chelsea, you can go to the next slide. So we can open it up for some questions. Here's our contact information if you want to reach out to us. Again, my name is Chloe. If you have specific questions about uniform guidance or your application process, you can reach out to me directly. We have that climate email for all general inquiries. You heard from Kenesha. And then Lutrina is our equity and outreach program analyst. She didn't present today, but she's here. And then Chessa, who's been on the back end recording and moving through slides for us. So I'll open it up to questions. I can read the questions. Or if you guys want, that can work. So I actually don't see any in the chat. So if anybody has a question, you can put it in the chat now.
You can also come off mute if you do have a question. What qualifies as commodity? That's a really broad definition, Dr. Walsh. So that includes, your various crops, and it also includes animal products, dairy, and forestry products. So fairly broad. Aquaculture tends to be fairly complex for us, or out of scope for us. I know that USDA is open to certain things, but that tends to be a more challenging thing. The one thing to keep in mind is that it really is about the practices, right? So you can take a look at the Climate-Smart ag and forestry list as an example. So typically the commodities that would be included with this are those that benefit from those types of practices, if that makes sense. No need for UEI as an applicant, and that typically links to the SAM.gov question. Chloe, I might punt it to you, and if we can't answer it now, we will certainly get back to you, Glenn.
This is a good question. I think we're gonna have to get back to you. There's some changing guidance happening right now with uniform guidance around UEI requirements. And so I don't want to get it confused with what's going to change and what's the current standard, because that I just learned about these changes and they're like fresh in my mind. And so I'm going to wait to answer that. And we can put it
in
know
the FAQ once we get that out, and we can put an announcement out once that's there, Chloe. That would probably be the best.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, so we'll clarify that soon. I'll write a note to myself to make sure that I get the correct information for you.
Okay, great. And then there was another question as to whether this grant requires a formal resolution from the board for the application. We've been kind of flexible on this one. I think that's really a conversation between you and your board, but we would be looking for letters of support and concurrence to enter into the grant. Any other questions? We put a link, let's put it back in the chat over here, Charlotte. But we'll have it on our main webpage for our Climate-Smart Commodities. So we will record that and put out an announcement in an email when everything's uploaded. Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions here, cool beans. Okay, I like that. Always feel free to reach out to us at climate@nacdnet.org. We do monitor that box. And so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If as you're going through the process, you need to brainstorm something, we are certainly here for you. So just let us know, and we're glad to either respond in writing or set up some time if that would also be helpful. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.